2 years ago, I made a video titled Silent Hill 2: The Best Game Ever Made. I praised it for its incredible story and its ability to interpret the unscripted choices its players make during gameplay. Fast forward to today, and we are solidly in the remake and remaster era, where everything old is new again. When the remake of Silent Hill 2 was announced, I was both excited by the idea of revisiting one of my favorite games, but also worried that one of the greatest experiences this medium has to offer would be misunderstood and butchered. Now, having played the game, I can confidently say that Silent Hill 2 Remake is fantastic, and it may even be the best remake ever made. Today, I want to talk about what an amazing job Bloober Team did in adapting Silent Hill 2, how their approach to remaking the game created a unique companion to the original instead of something meant to replace it. I also want to analyze the remake on its own merit and detail why so many of its own creative decisions work. And finally, I'd like to discuss why neither this remake nor the original game are truly perfect and why that's a good thing. This is Silent Hill 2 Remake is almost perfect. Of all the games you could choose to remake, Silent Hill 2 is probably the hardest. While there are obvious areas where the game could be improved, modernized, or otherwise enhanced, they're all wrapped inside of one of gaming's most abstract thematic journeys that has proven impossible to replicate. The Silent Hill 2 remake understands this, and it doesn't try to copy things like the original game's surreal, Lynchian tone or its famous approach to voice acting. Instead, the remake offers a very grounded and realistic look at the characters and setting of Silent Hill 2, which is not something that I ever thought would work. With Realism, you run the risk of showing too much and disconnecting visual elements from their original context for the sake of high fidelity. But Silent Hill 2 Remake uses realism as a tool to supplement the original game's narrative, themes, and gameplay mechanics to help form its own. So, what does a more grounded take with today's modern fidelity add to Silent Hill 2? For starters, Realism humanizes the characters in ways that the original game wasn't able to. We can see that James has taken his wedding ring off, Angela has chewed her nails raw, and despite a slight redesign, Eddie looks more like a man in a child's body than he ever has. I don't think that this is something that totally reads in the original game, but Eddie dresses like a little boy. The remake's Realism is able to further expose Eddie's infantile nature to clue us into his struggles and what brought him to Silent Hill in the first place. The remake does the same thing with Maria. They did redesign her, but she's still a temptress, and in some very subtle ways that the game now hides in its new cutscenes. In one of the remake's new scenes, she tries to get James to drink. When James refuses, you can see her eyes go to the glass, then dart back to James in a last-ditch effort to persuade him before she gives up. And after that, you can see James visibly struggle with his decision to not drink. Realism doesn't have to be a detriment to a game, and Silent Hill 2 Remake wisely uses it to explore the depths of its characters. It helps us infer different things about these versions of them, often using micro-expressions in their non-verbal communication. The reason this approach works is because the remake isn't competing with the original game. It's found its own ways to tell us things about these characters by portraying more nuance in their looks and mannerisms. The remake doesn't even copy original scenes one-to-one. The changes are deliberate and clever. In both the original and the remake, when James meets Eddie, he's vomiting. But only in the remake does James say this the second time he meets him.
Well, at least you got your appetite back.
You can see the way that Eddie takes that comment and probably links it to his weight, even though James likely didn't mean it that way. There was a large effort across the entire game to subvert what you would expect from a remake, and it pays off because you're able to experience the game from a new lens and not just a visually updated version. There was tremendous risk in adding anything to the original game because it would only work if Bloober Team understood the characters, but they clearly did. Of course, the town of Silent Hill is as much a character as the rest of the cast, and the remake uses today's technology to give us a version of Silent Hill that looks older than we remember. The remake's environments are where I think you can start to feel the influence of more modern franchises like The Last of Us, which has heavy emphasis on post-apocalyptic world detail. In the original game, Silent Hill looks like a town that's frozen in time, but in the remake, Silent Hill feels like it's losing a battle against nature. The town is empty, but it's being reclaimed by vegetation as a consequence of not having any maintenance. There's a thick layer of grime, dust, or mold on everything because all traces of human life are being erased by the weather. As Rust Cole once elegantly put it, Silent Hill is like someone's memory of a town, and the memory is fading. The remake also has some stylistic additions to Silent Hill that I think are quite interesting. In Silent Hill 1, it was snowing, and that was an unsettling detail because it added a pinch of life to an otherwise uncomfortable and desolate place. The original Silent Hill 2 had no snow. There was nothing but fog and darkness. The remake adds these falling leaves everywhere, and they're such an amazing detail. It makes Silent Hill feel more alive and dead at the same time. Falling leaves indicates one thing working as we understand it would in reality, but the rest of the town doesn't look or behave like that. Part of the remake's South Vale segment now has rain too, which explains the puddles throughout the town that look like they just belong. The visual change that shocked me the most was Otherworld. The remake introduces players to Otherworld more obviously than the original Silent Hill 2. I believe the first transition to Otherworld in the original game is from Woodside to Blue Creek, but the Woodside apartments are so decrepit that the passage to Otherworld never registered for some players. There is absolutely no mistaking it in the remake. The switch from Woodside to Blue Creek is like going from a condemned building to hell. James's Otherworld in the original game is a damp and moldy place, and the remake manages to keep that theme while also introducing elements of Alessa's Otherworld, like rust, fences, and cages. Bloober was also able to implement some of the dynamic environment horror they're known for in Otherworld, using it to make the player question their surroundings. The Otherworld atmosphere is honestly so oppressive that you don't even want to move. Everything about it screams that it's a place where no one should be. When you don't even have the safety of a familiar environment, your brain rejects the very notion of exploring. And this is true for more than just Otherworld. The remake's prison level is terrifying. Where the remake really succeeds with its environments is in the fact that you can play the original game's levels and still have no idea what to expect from the remake's versions of them. Almost every area where the layout hasn't been totally changed and expanded gives you new objectives and places to go. I was surprised at times by which locations are now open in the remake that weren't in the original game. That's without mentioning that all of the puzzles have been reworked, just like the original game's combat and boss battles. This is where we get to the elements of the remake that keep the spirit of the original game, but can be judged fully on their own merit because they're a complete overhaul of existing mechanics. The first I'd like to talk about is the combat. Silent Hill 2 Remake has the best combat in a Silent Hill game. I played the game on hard combat difficulty, and my god, what an experience. I never thought that a Silent Hill game would feature such a high level of skill expression, but what the remake does with its combat is make every single enemy a real threat. I have never been more scared to fight one enemy in a survival horror game than this. On hard difficulty, one hit from an enemy usually does significant damage, and you die in about 4 hits. The AI is much faster and much more aggressive than it is on standard. You get less ammo and less health pickups as well. What this results in is what I believe to be one of the best survival experiences in a survival horror game. For combat, Silent Hill 2 Remake adds a dodge mechanic, and you're required to learn dodge timing and the attack patterns of enemies if you want any chance of playing on hard. Where it feels like most Silent Hill games are trying to keep the player character alive to prolong their suffering, Silent Hill 2 Remake is the first game in the franchise that is trying to kill you at all times. In the original game, there wasn't much threat from any enemy that wasn't a boss. You could just hit them repeatedly over the head, stunning them in place until they died. You cannot do that in the remake. The lying figures will burst into vomit, the nurses will grab James's weapon, and the mannequins will dodge if you try to spam attacks on them. You can use this to your advantage to bait out their attack chain, but some enemies like nurses have 3 different attack patterns, and you have to predict which one is going to come out so you can either dodge or attack them right after. It's almost like a Souls game in that sense. The mannequin Pacquiaos are easily the scariest enemy in the game for me because the geniuses at Bloober decided that they would hide them everywhere. Nowhere is safe from these things, to the point where I would carefully walk into all rooms and try to see if there were some hiding. And even if you find one, there's probably another in some other corner just waiting to jump out. Because of the back and forth nature of combat, every encounter is a real fight, and there's no better feeling than beating the enemies without taking any damage. It's funny that Silent Hill has always been regarded as a story-first survival horror game, with the action-oriented gameplay taking a back seat. This is the first Silent Hill game where I think the quality of the combat matches the quality of the story, and that's most obvious in the remake's boss battles. For a studio that has never done combat in general, it's baffling how good Bloober made the new boss fights. In the original game, boss battles weren't very dynamic, and that's not something that was unique to Silent Hill 2. Boss battles across many survival horror games of that era basically consisted of the player just running around the boss and shooting at distance. The new over-the-shoulder camera is able to put us right next to Silent Hill 2's disgusting cast of bosses, and like the standard enemies, they've all got attack patterns that you have to watch out for. The bosses all hit like a truck, and are real tests of skill on hard, as they seemingly have more health and are considerably more aggressive. Staying alive during these encounters is both stressful and fun. The first Pyramid Head fight is one of my favorites, and I think it captures the essence of what Pyramid Head is meant to represent. Even the arena you fight him in is full of cages, reminiscent of the Pyramid Head painting you find in the Historical Society. There's an incredible attention to detail that persists across every aspect of this game. One of my favorite underrated additions is whenever the player has to make a scripted choice for James. That would be putting his hand somewhere or jumping down holes. In the original game, these are just a single button press, but in the remake, they're multiple button presses. And one would think that doesn't make much of a difference, but I see it as James doing something versus the player being an active participant in James doing something. Do you really want to put your hand here? Are you sure you want to jump down these holes? You have to make those choices for James, and doing this across multiple prompts adds a layer of uneasiness for the player themselves as they have to commit to that choice. You can also hear James psyching himself up while you decide, which is a great detail. Now, for everything I've praised, I do think there are some issues here and there. The South Vale Otherworld section on hard is too hard. There are enemies everywhere, and you often run the risk of getting 2 or 3v1'd, which doesn't feel in line with the combat ideology of the rest of the game. It's hard, but fair, except in this one segment. The amount of enemies discourages exploration, and because you're in the dark, it's harder to effectively route for items because it's harder to see them. Although the game deserves credit for its vast amount of HUD options, I still feel like the game isn't entirely designed to be played without one. Yes, just like in the original, James moves his head to note items in the environment, but the remake adds items in drawers, and if you have no HUD, you're basically just spamming the interact button anytime you're near them to see which ones have items. It's worth noting that the remake does do a great job of identifying interactables and directions for the player without the use of an immersion-breaking eyesore like yellow paint. Everywhere you need to go is usually covered in white drapes, which is an extension of the town's aesthetic and fits in well. Finally, the performance needs to be better. It is actually a detriment to the game at points, especially when you're doing combat. I suspect that it will be patched, but as of the time I'm making this video and across my first playthrough, performance was fairly inconsistent. With those small complaints aside, I am so happy that this remake exists and that it's so different to what everyone seems to have expected. It doesn't replace the original game, and I don't think that that was ever the intention while creating it. We have so many famous stories across fiction that get told multiple times over with different interpretations, but only in video games are the retellings sometimes used to supplant their originals as if the original no longer has any value. That's not the case here. Silent Hill 2 Remake is almost like an adaptation rather than a remake. Bloober clearly had too much love and respect for the original game to try and one-up it, instead opting to adapt its material and tell it their own way. Even the fantastic new interpretations by original staff members Masahiro Ito and Akira Yamaoka don't feel like they're trying to correct mistakes with their old work as much as add things they've learned in the time since then. Ultimately, the greatest compliment I can pay to Silent Hill 2 Remake is that I'd recommend it alongside the original. These are two games that should be experienced together. Before I go, why do I think it's a good thing that neither of these games are perfect? I am vehemently against putting games or other works on a pedestal. Mistakes are a part of life, and I think that fictional works reflect that. Oftentimes, works have flaws or things that can be viewed differently that you don't even realize when you initially consume the material. Perfection is boring. It implies that there's nothing new to be learned or nothing that can be added to something. If Silent Hill 2 was perfect, we'd have missed out on all of the great, unique things this remake has to offer. No era or period of time has a monopoly on creativity, and to actually believe that says more about one's own limited perspective than about the zeitgeist around them. The future is now, but the past is now too. The best games are usually the ones that know where they came from and understand where they are. Thanks for watching.